Thank you for listening to the ThePPod from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. Please note, due to the nature of this podcast, themes relating to the abuse and neglect of children are discussed, with the content being designed for an adult audience for educational purposes in order to protect children from harm. Therefore, listener discretion is advised and the content unsuitable for children.
Welcome to the ThePPod.
Welcome back to the ThePPod, the partnership podcast from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. And pleased today to bring you another podcast special based on the updates to some of the recent information sharing guidance from the government. And I'm pleased to say today I'm joined by a bit of an expert in this field who's spent many, many years now looking at consent, looking at information sharing, and looking at systems joining up so we can better share information in order to safeguard children. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Jill Baller, who is the Service Manager, Partnership Transformation. So Jill, welcome to the ThePPod. Good to have you here.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
No, pleasure. So before we sort of get into it, if it's all right, what I would like to do is just sort of take us back a little bit to the background around this. Because obviously over the years, there's been numerous updates to some of the statutory guidance, the latest of which being the update to Working Together to Safeguard Children, the main statutory guidance for all agencies, and that update taking place back in December of 2023. And we were expecting at that point in time to also have the complementary update to the information sharing guidance, which was last updated alongside the previous update to Working Together back in 2018. So we've had a bit of a delay in that becoming published, and but I'm very pleased to say that just a couple of weeks ago now, that has been now published and provides a really good guide to making sure we're effectively sharing information. And it's been an area that has, over the years, caused a bit of confusion about what information can be shared, what information can't be shared, particularly in relation to GDPR and other legislation. So I'm pleased to say we're here today to hopefully debunk some of the mystery around the information sharing, around safeguarding children, and hopefully give you those sort of key bits of updates that you need to be aware of to make sure that we are working in partnership with other agencies. And by doing so, we are effectively sharing information. So, Jill, that's a bit of background for us. So thanks for joining us. Before we sort of get into it, I mentioned your title there, Service Manager, Partnership Transformation. But could you sort of actually explain what you actually do?
Thanks, Steve. Yes, so I've been working for the local authority in this field for the last 10 years. And historically, I came over from Somerset Constabulary. And a passion of mine is around supporting children and families to improve their outcomes. So children go on to have better life chances. So when I started working for the local authority, I became very involved with the Troubled Families Programme as it was then, which is now supporting families, became the coordinator for Somerset. And one of the areas where there was a key opportunity to invest some of that funding from the programme was around joining up the multi-agency workforce. So historically, our data systems have been very fragmented, lots of silo working, and we know to safeguard children and effectively help them to have better life chances and choices, we need to join up information to keep them safe. So it was interesting, I heard you mention, Steve, around GDPR. And we know that some practitioners in Somerset are not confident when sharing information. And some feel that since the introduction of the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, and that became law in May 2018, they've been worried about sharing information. So I'm really hoping by talking it through with you today that we can allay some of those fears, we can build some confidence with practitioners, and we can also help them understand where they can get further information. You talked as well around the non-statutory guidance that's been a bit delayed, but has come out only in April of this year. And the purpose of that really was to install some confidence with practitioners, supporting that legal framework around information sharing and providing a guide on the core principles. And I've looked through and worked through that document. I was part of the group with the Department for Education where we were looking at the revision of the Working Together guidance. And you'll see in both of those documents that there's a real shift change in the use of consent. And that's where people get really confused, Steve, because they think that they can only share information if there's a risk of immediate harm, safeguarding for children, or that they've got consent. But actually, the majority of the time, consent isn't really the legal basis that should be relied upon. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So thinking about the definition set out in Working Together to Safeguard Children around that safeguarding definition. And I think this is something that we need to broadcast, and we need to help practitioners understand that when we talk about safeguarding children, we're not just talking about that immediate risk of harm. Safeguarding now goes way beyond that, so much as prevention, early help, and ensuring that children grow up in circumstances consistent with safe and effective care. So, that safeguarding definition is really broadened. So when we talk about sharing with a different legal basis around safeguarding, we're encompassing that prevention and early help.
It's interesting, actually, because one of the things I picked up from the original draft consultation document around this, which I thought was quite interesting, is that previously we used to talk about significant harm a lot. And like you say, in terms of consent, it was, if there's risk of significant harm for a child or young person. Actually, one thing I was really interested looking at the consultation document, the draft, and now the final version, is you will not find the word significant in there at all. I know, because I did a bit of a search for it. But it's interesting, like you say, actually removing that significant, because up until that point, we're kind of saying it needs to be at such a sort of crisis point where children are really at risk of severe harm that actually potentially we can override information sharing. But actually, you're right. There's been a strong emphasis for years around early help support for families, about that preventative work with families, and trying to stop things from getting to that point in the first place, rather than sort of being reactionary when it does happen. So I thought that was quite an interesting kind of tweak, just removing that one word significant there.
Absolutely. And that broadening as well of the safeguarding definition. So the non-statutory guidance, it really focuses on the sharing of information where there are safeguarding concerns about the child. And remember, this includes early help and prevention. And then under the data protection law, you need to identify at least one legal basis under Article 6. So there's 6 different legal bases you can choose from, consent being one of them. But consent isn't always the most appropriate. So in the local authority, the work that I've been doing on joining up information and being able to pull that into a single digital view of a child, and then enable practitioners, both internal to the local authority and our external partners, to have use of that, we use a legal basis called public task. So that legal basis allows us to then join up information for the purposes of safeguarding children and their families. So if we think about the use of consent in 2 different ways, so if we split consent, so we have consent to be supported by a service or consent to be part of an assessment, we absolutely need families to consent to be part of it. If we're thinking about the processing of information, we're not asking for families to consent, because it's not the most appropriate, because we need to ensure that consent is freely given.
Yep.
So thinking about the role that we have within the local authority, we do have power over people. And if individuals refuse to give their consent, or they might wish to withdraw it in the circumstances, we wouldn't allow that to happen in certain circumstances. For example, if we've added them to our case management system. So we have to use a different legal basis, and for that we're using public task. So I think the other thing to think about is those organisations and partners across our early help partnership who perhaps don't have that public task legal basis. So if you work with children and their families within the voluntary or private sector, public task wouldn't be your function. So it's more probably likely that legitimate interests might be more appropriate. And it talks about this in that non-statutory guidance. And I just thought that was really helpful to hear how we at the local authority use public task and what the legal basis might be going forward for other partners out within our early help system.
So when we're sort of talking about public task, essentially what we're kind of talking about is as part of services, part of statutory services, there is a legal responsibility laid out in the statutory guidance, like Working Together to Safeguard Children, to safeguard children. So we have that responsibility. And am I right in thinking it's in a nutshell saying, in order to fulfill that responsibility, you have to be able to share information, because if you can't do your job properly. Is that right?
Absolutely. And you can't safeguard children effectively because if you only know one piece of the puzzle, you can't possibly make an informed decision on the risks to the child if other partners or agencies or systems are holding different pieces of information. So in order to safeguard that child, we need to pull all this information together, and we're not going to ask the family's consent because we have this legal basis to do it. But what we are going to do is be open, transparent with families, and that's really important. So engaging with the family, explaining what we're doing in relation to the sharing and processing of the data, and gaining their cooperation. But we're not asking for their consent. The other way to think about it is you have to identify the correct legal basis at the start. You can't kind of switch about.
Okay.
So if, for example, I knew that there was maybe adult offending within the household, and I wanted to speak to the probation officer, and I asked the family to consent to me speaking to probation, and they said no, I'd then switch from consent to public task because actually I've got a legal basis to be able to speak to probation and I want to keep that child safe. So that is inherently unfair on families. So it's really important that we get this right. So we've got a programme of work within Somerset now. And it kind of was generated really from some work we did for the Department for Education. And I was really surprised 18 months, 2 years ago, when the DFE surveyed all the top tier authorities in England, and over half of them felt that they needed to strengthen their safeguarding arrangements to information sharing for children. And that really surprised me. So if we think about the Josh McAllister Care Review, one of the recommendations from that care review was around local authorities and its partners achieving frictionless information sharing. So thinking about that recommendation, the Department for Education has formed their digital and data priorities, and that sits within it. So we've been working alongside the NHS South West and Central Commissioning Support Unit, who have information governance experts. And we've delivered a project in partnership with them and the Department of Education to publish a Tier 2 data sharing template and toolkit. So that's on our Somerset Council website now. And that is to support all other local authorities in strengthening those safeguarding arrangements. And the work's received really positive feedback. We had the ICO as part of our task and finish group. So we really feel that it's robust, that it sets a good framework, and they're now starting a piece of work looking at a Tier 1 data sharing agreement to really help those other authorities improve their robustness of it.
Because this is the thing, isn't it? It comes up time and time and time again for years and years and years when we look at learning from reviews on a local basis, on a national basis. It's nearly always there saying there's a lack of information sharing. And actually, some of that is person-to-person information sharing, but some of it is around systems information sharing, isn't it? And actually, again, if we can't join up those pieces of the jigsaw, we don't get that holistic view of what the circumstances are for children, for young people and families. So actually, by being able to join up those pieces of information, you get that wider perspective, you get that holistic view to be able to safeguard effectively, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. And if you, like you say, those safeguarding practice reviews highlighting information sharing as a failure over and over again. So in Somerset, we started to think about this maybe 5-6 years ago, and we're national leaders within our data culture. So we built a data warehouse and we pulled information right across the partnership, which involved me building trust with partners, making sure we had the legal basis, making sure we've done data protection impact assessments, our privacy notices were published, all the elements that we needed to be able to do this, along with that relationship. And I always say when I'm talking to other authorities that actually it doesn't matter if you've got all that wrapped around you. If you don't have that relationship with a partner, they won't share their data. We're really fortunate in Somerset because a lot of the practitioners and myself have been working in Somerset for a long time. So those long-standing relationships were already built. The police have been instrumental in their sharing for us. So we now receive information from about 35 different organisations and partners into our system in Somerset Council. We match individuals to families, and then we can display it back to those practitioners who, if it's proportionate, relevant and necessary. And as long as you can satisfy that with your legal basis wrapped around you, you can effectively provide this single digital view of a child and their family.
So just sort of taking us back a little bit. So we've got the legal basis that we've talked about. there. You mentioned something earlier as well, which I think is really important here, is that often consent can be a little bit confused about exactly what we're talking about. And I think it was useful, and we've talked before about actually if we separate that out in our heads around consent to engage with the service, which, like we say, actually you have to have it there, because you can't, even if you said, okay, well, I don't have consent, but I'm going to do it anyway, the family wouldn't engage with it probably. So there's consent for engagement. And then importantly, sort of splitting that out, there's then consent for information sharing, which actually we don't need consent for the information sharing. And so we've got that side. So I think that's quite useful to separate that out. Consent for engagement with services, but for information sharing, it doesn't need consent. But alongside that, importantly, the strong ethos within both working together to safeguard children and the non-statutory information sharing guidance is very strongly about working openly, transparently with families and informing them. So I just want to kind of emphasize it. This isn't sort of opening floodgates to just talk to everybody about everything to do with people's lives. And the other bit that you said there as well is that it needs to be, and I'm going to misquote you here, reasonable, proportionate. Is that right?
Proportionate, relevant, and necessary.
That's the one. Thank you. So that's really key. So we need to keep it quite specific, and we need to be open and transparent with families about what information we're sharing, with whom, and for what purpose, really. But we're not asking for consent to do that. We're informing that as part of our kind of job, we have to do that.
Absolutely. And that's a really good summary, Steve. And the law requires us to publish a privacy notice on our website, which we absolutely do. But in my mind, and to satisfy the element of being transparent, I want to make sure as many children, their parents, their caregivers know how we're using our data in Somerset. So we've met with the Youth Forum and we've talked to them around Transform. And we've done some Q&A sessions with them. We used Menti. They were absolutely fantastic. And they really understood why we needed to join up this information. And they said, actually, it'd be really helpful if the school knew who my CAMHS practitioner was. So that came as quite a surprise for me. So that was really interesting. We've done some work in Bristol with young people. And they've said to us, absolutely, we're fine that you join the data app, but we don't want you to use it against us, which we absolutely wouldn't.
Fair enough.
I've gone to a number of parent forums and I've talked to parents about the way we're working. And they said things like, we're happy that you join information up and we understand you do, but we only want you to share fact, not judgment. Mm-hmm. Well, our system obviously is based on data. Technology will only share fact. It doesn't share judgment. So we've recently sent a survey out to all the parents and caregivers of children who's attended the holiday activities and food clubs at schools. So we're waiting for the results to come back. So we're trying every angle to talk to parents about the way we work, thinking about being open and transparent. And that proportionate, relevant, and necessary is really helpful, Steve, to keep in the back of your mind, along with, engage, explain, cooperate. And these are the terminologies that you'll hear now going forward. So consent will start to slide into the background because, as long as we're working in this way, it's legal and it's absolutely what we should be doing to safeguard our children.
Definitely. And I think understandably it's an area people are worried about. And again, just in terms of being open and transparent with families, there are, of course, times where we wouldn't want to do that. And again, I think that's an area that's been quite nicely summarised actually in the updated guidance there.
Yeah.
In fact, I've got it in front of me, if that's okay, just to kind of quote on here, because we want to be open with families, we want to be transparent, we want to be sharing things proportionately, but there are times where we wouldn't want to do that. So just in terms of the sort of, to quote the information sharing guidance here, it says you should be open, you should be sharing information with the family that you're disclosing to other people. This is unless seeking to discuss a potential concern which would put the child or others, so it could be an adult as well, at risk of harm. Again, they've removed the word significant there, but it's at risk of harm. If you have professional or legal duty to share certain information and the child or carer therefore does not have a choice about information sharing, they should be informed about what information sharing has been taking place and the information will be used and wherever possible, safe to do so. However, you should not inform the child or parent or carer about the decision to share information if doing so could put a child or others at further risk of harm or could compromise effective safeguarding arrangements, including police investigations. So just that last little bit, I think, is quite a useful summary for people just to kind of think about. And actually, we should be open, we should be transparent, but you need to kind of make that judgment of actually, if I do so, is that going to place a child at risk of harm, really? And I think what I'm keen to emphasize here as well is that just because you feel it might be an awkward conversation, or you might break down some of the relationship you got with that parent, or it might be kind of quite a difficult conversation, that's not a reason not to be open and transparent. It's really about if you feel like that by doing so, it would put a child at risk of harm or an adult at risk of harm, or prejudice good safeguarding practice around that child.
It's really helpful, Steve, that you read that out, and and the element that you picked up there around the police investigation, because actually information that you see within maybe a joined up system, you might then need to share that obviously with another colleague, and people then say to me, well, I understand about joining the information up, but I don't know then if I can onwardly share it. So any information you see within your system, you treat it the same as any other information that you'd receive from a partner, and the same principles apply. Is it reasonably necessary and proportionate for me to share this information for a lawful purpose that I'm required to fulfil, which often is safeguarding? And then in that case, you should reveal the minimum amount of information to achieve what's required. And you should also consider then whether you could do harm in sharing the information. And an example that I talk about is maybe if the police shared that a person was a suspect in a rape investigation, you felt you needed to share the information, there is a risk of harm in interfering with that police investigation. So in that case, you should check back with the organisation who shared it. And if you do recognise there's no risk, then you can onwardly share it. So I just think, that's absolutely worth bearing in mind. And we've got, experts who can help us in this area as well. So if we're absolutely stuck, we can speak to our data protection officers. They are more than happy to help us and work through some of these issues. And the other thing I will say, Steve, is we're starting to put together a toolkit to support practitioners become more confident. And some of that toolkit, obviously this podcast will form part of that toolkit. We're looking at doing some bite-sized training offers to help practitioners. And similarly there, we'll be putting some documentation on the Safeguarding Partnership website to help people.
Yeah, and there's lots of activity taking place in the background at the moment, and we will have that out shortly. I know, Jill, we've been looking at a video you put together recently. I know you've been doing some webinars around this. We're working currently on a short animation, just kind of explain the key points and, like I say, briefings as well for people, because it is a change. It's quite a significant change, but it's an important one that people need to be aware of. I think the other thing that I just want to stress from this as well, from looking at it, is that what underpins this around information sharing is around having a safeguarding concern for a child, young person. And I think that's really important to emphasize, because there are times where we might be working with a family and might see a real benefit of sharing information. Just off the top of my head, if you're working with a family who have some debt and finance issues, you might feel, okay, well, in that case, I'm going to have to contact Citizen Advice and I'm going to have to talk to them about it. And I don't need consent for that. But ultimately, actually, is that debt and finance difficulty, is that placing a child at risk of harm? And if the answer is yes, then that's fine around the information sharing. But if the answer is that you don't have a safeguarding concern for that child, then you still got to get that consent to share that information. And that's the fundamental sort of underpinning of all of this, is there must be a safeguarding concern for a child, and that must be the reason why you're sharing that information.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Steve. And if you think about your example, debt and finance, why would you not speak to the parents? Why would you not say, are you happy that because consent doesn't have to be a wet signature on a assessment or on a form. It can be verbal consent.
Thank you for looking after me and making sure I'm safe. I know sometimes it's hard to know how to do the right thing and what you can or can't do to make sure I'm cared for properly. There's lots of laws in this country which are supposed to help, but sometimes people get worried that they might get in trouble for doing something right. In case it turns out they shouldn't have done that, there's lots of times when people caring for me should have talked to each other, but didn't because they were worried that they might get it wrong, and that meant that not everyone knew what was happening and children have got hurt. To help keep me safe, I need you to talk to other people about some of the things that you might be worried about. Just like my football team can't win a match if we don't tell each other what we're doing and what we need them to do. The problem is, sometimes people think you need me or my parents' permission to talk to each other, but if you're doing this to keep me safe, that's okay. Although you don't need permission, it's important to be honest with me and my parents about when you're telling other people about keeping me safe and what you're sharing with them. Unless this would make me less safe or worried, it's to do with breaking the law. When you're sharing things, though, please don't share everything about my life with everyone. It's really personal stuff, and I'm sure you wouldn't want everyone knowing everything about your life. So only share what you really need to keep me safe. If you think another service can help, though, you need to ask if it's okay to get them involved, unless it's really, really serious, and it's felt the only way to keep me safe is with a child protection plan. I know it's hard to make the right decision sometimes, but there's some really helpful guides out there which you can look at and tell you what you should and shouldn't do and why. Me and my friends need you to help keep us safe, and the best way to do that is to be honest, be open, and talk to each other. Thanks.
We're going to be putting out lots of information, lots of resources out there across the workforce to really sort of get our heads around these quite subtle sometimes, but quite important changes. So keep your eyes peeled out for that. And I'll put some links in the description for this episode as well. Jill, I'm just wondering, as I mentioned right at the start of this, you're involved in lots of different things, got lots of fingers in different pies, and certainly around information sharing. So would you be able to just kind of talk to us about some of the other work you're doing around information sharing and joining up sort of agencies?
So the first thing we've been doing, which is really relevant to this, is following the survey that the Department of Education sent out to the top tier authorities. We were asked to do some consultancy work. So some of my Somerset colleagues are supporting 27 other local authorities with their approach to not just information sharing, but data culture as well. So we've been working for many years now trying to identify, join up and deliver on a system which is a single digital view of a child. In Somerset, that's called Transform Family View. So we had a good effort at it a couple of years ago, but the DfE 18 months ago provided us funding to rebuild our system using modern technology, which we've harvested and is incredible, and then write a guide of how to do it for middle managers and technical colleagues to support them in the building of the platform. So we've now finished that, and we're really proud actually that the data quality is really of a high standard. We've rolled out to our family intervention workers and our social workers. The response has been incredible around that overview that they get when they can understand risk and vulnerability, threat and harm for a child and their family, and look at other households or individuals that are influencing that child. So to help us build it appropriately, we did lots of user research with social workers and family intervention practitioners to really understand the level of time and the sorts of information that was a burden to them or that was a challenge. And Josh McAllister called it the retrieval burden. So we know that 2/3 of social workers work with children, 1/3 don't actually work with children at all. And of those 2/3, they only spend 1/3 of their time dedicated to that child and the families. So spending time gathering information and understanding the true picture is something obviously that our social workers spend a lot of time doing. Things, for example, Steve, like the NHS number, it's sometimes really tricky to get hold of, but really important if a social worker's making that health referral. So just things like that, we were able to join up with the NHS digital spine and pull that through automatically. So now it shows in Transform Family View. Another area which is often sits on the peripheral, I'd say, of early help is housing. Housing are incredibly incredible, the information that they have on children, their families, their households, what they know about their tenants, and the support that they can offer them is absolutely outstanding. But often they're one of the last to join a team around the family meetings. In Somerset, we've got over 24 different housing providers. So it's quite tricky if a family doesn't know their housing provider to know who to speak to in the first instance. So we'd be able to pull all the housing information from right across our social landlord stock and pull that into Transform Family View. So you can see at a glance if the family are in social housing, who you should be contacting to pull them into those team around the family meetings. So things like that don't in themselves seem very much, but if you add 5 or 10 minutes on every piece of that information, that's quite a chunk of your resource during the day.
Absolutely. And even knowing that those people are involved in the first place. Because again, that's where it falls down sometimes in terms of information sharing, is that people just didn't know that a certain agency were involved.
Absolutely.
So like you say, just being able to sort of see, actually, yes, there is this agency involved, or they have been involved, or they've just closed their involvement, and actually could be really key in just joining up those dots, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. And, this system doesn't replace any professional conversations, but it takes you to that person to have the conversation with the first time. Yeah. So telling you their email address, means you can directly contact them. So CAMS, for example, is a good one. CAMS now share their data with us. We match it up into our system. And if the young person's supported by CAMS, we show, the minimum information needed. So who the CAMS worker is, their email address, and when they started working with them. And that's all the information that practitioner then needs to join up that response and tailor support to the individual. And that reduces duplication as well, Steve, because actually if a piece of work's being done by one practitioner, then the other practitioner, doesn't need to do that piece of work. And that's really key at the moment when we're already stretched for time and resource.
Jill, well, thank you so much for spending a bit of time with us today and just kind of going through the updated information sharing guidance. And hopefully that's been useful for everybody listening here, just to give you a kind of a flavour of the key points in the updated guidance for us. Jill, are you able to signpost to sort of any other information, how people can find out more?
Absolutely. So the Somerset Council website has obviously got details of the programmes that we're working on, and that's got that data sharing template toolkit. The working together guidance and the non-statutory guidance that the Department of Education have published is an absolute a wealth of information and will really be helpful to people.
Great stuff. And I'll post any links to anything in the description for this episode. But as Jill mentioned, this only came out about 2 weeks or so ago now. So we're kind of furiously working in the background to produce those bite-sized briefings and the animations and the webinars and what have you. So please keep your eyes peeled on the SSCP website, social medias and everything else that we can think of to pull that together and get it out to you. So keep your eyes peeled. There will be more outcoming as soon as we can get it out to you. So Jill, thank you very much for your time today. Much appreciated.
Thanks ever so much, Steve. Really appreciate you inviting me.
No, pleasure. Thanks for speaking to us. And I'm sure we'll speak again on the ThePPod at some point again in the future. So take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Now, before you switch off from today's podcast, I've got some important information to share with you before we call it a day today. As you may be aware, we've been producing the ThePPod since September of last year, and now have racked up nearly 30 episodes, with 3,500 downloads in that time, which we're eternally grateful to you for. We've been lucky enough in that time to be able to speak with some amazing guests from all around the partnership, as well as from experts from around the country. So my special thanks to everyone who's been willing to talk to me here and share their expertise with a wide audience. With July rapidly hurtling towards its end, we're going to have a little break now throughout the summer to give us time to record plenty more episodes to bring to you. And we'll be back again in September, where we have a whole host of new subjects to bring you, including continuing our series with motivational interviewing expert Jackie Webb. Now, as part of the new episodes with Jackie, we're also planning an Ask the Expert special, where you can put to Jackie your MI-related questions. So if you have a burning MI question you'd like to raise, then send it in to us via the link in the description for this episode. And we'll go through those throughout the summer and see if we can pick out some really good questions for Jackie. But we've got loads more lined up for you for September, including hearing from leading national experts such as Karen Traceman as part of our Trauma Informed network, and some special 2-part episodes that were just too much to fit into the 45 minutes. Now, these include one on engaging fathers and another where we explore the world of online abuse and begin delving into what the future may hold in regards to protecting children from harm online. So before we end today's episode, I just wanted to give a huge thank you to everyone who has shown their support for the show, including Jill Baller, who we heard from in today's episode, and all of our guest presenters from the last 10 months, to everyone who's contacted us at theppod@somerset.gov.uk with their questions, comments or suggestions. And of course, I wanted to give a huge thank you to you for listening. But don't forget, we will be back after the summer, so don't go away, and I look forward to you joining us again in September at ThePPod.
Let's talk together to help keep children safe.